Anne Curthoys was the Manning Clark Professor at the Australian National University and an ARC Professorial Fellow at the University of Sydney. She's a Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia and the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Anne kindly agreed to be interviewed about how historians view the unknowns in their discipline and how they deal with them.
And you've written that there are three sources of uncertainty in history. The evidence to begin with, and then historians, and finally the narrative and analytical frameworks that are used for presenting history. If we just start with the evidence, where are the main unknowns or uncertainties in the historical record? Is it just a matter of too little data, or is there more besides?
There are a lot of difficulties. There is too little data, often there's no data at all. I think also sometimes there's just so much data that you don't know how to make sense of it at all. But I suppose the issue that concerns historians most is that data is usually very selective in some way, so that it represents usually the voices of the more powerful, the more literate, the more articulate in various ways. So it's very partial. And the other aspect is too that sometimes data is just missing for irrelevant reasons. I mean, a fire might have destroyed crucial data or whatever that may be, so that you get systematic biases, but you also get accidental ones as well.
In times past, as you know, some historians have tried to cast history as a kind of science, sort of like archaeology, let's say. Is that position still held to be tenable, or has it been abandoned entirely? Are there still people pursuing a kind of a science version of history?
I think there are very few people who would now say history is a science, but I think there are quite a lot who would say historians can be objective. I think that's where the argument really is now. I think the questioning of it as a science has been fairly complete, and that people acknowledge history as a different kind of discipline, a different kind of intellectual enterprise, with its own rules and its protocols and its ways of doing things. So it's not made up. It has ways of going about trying to find out what happened, but I don't think normally that would be called scientific. I think there's disagreement now about the idea of whether historians can be objective. So that many historians would say you can't fully, that you're always part of the society you live in. You have certain kind of frameworks of understanding, certain kinds of positions in the world, certain kinds of present-day concerns. I think there are still some who would say you can be reasonably objective, at least, that you can put aside your prejudices and your assumptions, and you can look at the historical record in a fairly objective way. I think the other thing to say, though, is that I think these debates were very intense about 10 years ago, and they seem to have died off a bit, as debates do. And so the disagreements, you get much less of the anxious discussion about the question of historians and objectivity today than you would have had, I think, 10 years ago, when it was a very sort of lively issue.
Right, okay, so if we're inevitably bound to our society, our culture, and our time, and therefore the prejudices and preferences that we've been socialized into, and all of that sort of thing, is it possible for historians to become enough self-aware that they identify those prejudices, at least they know what they are? Or is that ideal also unattainable?
I think you can be aware of your prejudices, but not completely, no. I think that I always find, for instance, if I look at something that I've written 10 or 20 years ago, I can see assumptions embedded in it that I didn't know I had then, because times have changed and I've got a different frame of reference for looking at it. And I think most historians would have the same experience. So I think no matter how hard you try, you're always going to have your ideas embedded in it. But I suppose the other thing that people would now say is that given that your assumptions and preferences are going to be embedded in what you do, perhaps another way of looking at it is to make that productive, to, instead of just trying to abandon your own ideas and your own background, try and work with it, foreground it, talk about it, be fairly directly personal if necessary, and use your speaking position and your location in a productive way. And I think that's where some of the really more recent discussion has gone, for instance, in the idea of ego histoire, which is literally the history of yourself, and that's the idea of using your own experience of historical events to pursue an understanding of them more closely. Obviously, that only applies to recent history, but so I think that's where some of the debate is now of being aware of where your speaking position and trying to use it productively rather than ignoring it or pretending it isn't there.
Okay, that's great. So, is this what post-structuralist or postmodernist perspectives can offer us? Ways of working productively with irreducible unknowns, biases, the fact that any of us are necessarily locked into limitations along those lines?
I think it does come from a post-structuralist impetus, but I don't think people who say that now would be, in very formal or strict terms, post-structuralist. That is to say, the post-structuralist kind of point about speaking position and the creation of texts and the importance of language and narrative and all those things is now, I think, sort of fairly well accepted, and so people accept that without going into a full kind of post-structuralist position.
Okay, and of course, you and John Docker came out a while ago with a book about history as fiction. Can you tell me something about what the main theme of that is? Is it that history necessarily involves creating fiction of some kind? Is that always inadvertent, or can historians, let's say, be deliberate about that?
Well, I think this is where there's a lot of debate continues at the moment, the relationship between history and fiction. I think our contribution was partly to look at how the issue has been debated over quite a long, century is a long debate about the relationship between history and fiction, and about history as a literary kind of form as well. And to say that the arguments about truth and fiction and objectivity and all of those are very long debates, and that the more recent debates, which particularly did involve post-structuralism, are kind of a recent version of a longer debate. But I think where some of the argument is now is, well, what does that lead to in terms of how we should write history? That is to say, to what extent are we aware of if we're aware of the literary nature of history, how does that affect the kind of history we write? And one of the important figures in this debate was Hayden White, who an American sort of historical philosopher, I suppose you'd call him. And Hayden White was very stressing the fictional nature of historical narrative. That is, there's a kind of certain implotment in the way historians write. They might not be at all aware of it, but they use it, they set up beginnings, middles and endings, they do all sorts of things that fiction writers do. And I think that in Is History Fiction, John Docker and I were, in a sense, aligning ourselves with that position, although we were also saying that the kind of literary foundations of some of that argument we might do differently. But we were aligning ourselves with the position that historians do write narrative and they do construct stories, and there's a literary and character to it that they're often not fully aware of. But I think where some of the debate now is, well, what do you do, for example, when the historical record's missing, the part of the story you want to tell, there's no record? A lot of writers, I'm not talking about historians so much, but writers will want to imagine that missing bit. They will want to speculate at least about the missing part of the story. And so you get a lot of people now who write historical fiction or mixed kind of fact fiction kind of writing, where it is based on historical research, but they also produce sections which are more speculative and sort of in a sense made up. My position, though, even though I'm very interested in the position of, I do see that history is a kind of a narrative form and has a lot in common with fiction, but I, at the same time, would make a very strong demarcation in that one sense between history and fiction, in that I think you've got to be very clear with your readers, with your audience, about what you're doing. That if you do speculate, you have to say it's a speculation. That if you do make a dialogue, you have to say that's what you're doing. You can't pretend that it's there in the record. And so you can mix genres and you can mix things, but you have to be very clear always that that's what you're doing. And in that sense, I would take probably what some people might think is a quite conservative position, in that historians have to be very clear about what they're doing.
So, so Rutherford's books about New York and Paris, the history of Dublin, the history of these cities, They're novels, and so there's no way anybody's going to class him as an historian, or likewise Hilary Mantel with her books, wonderful books on Thomas Cromwell.
I agree. I think historical fiction is a genre of its own, and I don't class it as history. On the other hand, I would say that it often helps many people to understand the past much better than they otherwise would. So I'm not averse to it or critical of it. I think we just need to be careful about our categories, really. And in fact, I think historical fiction has really taken off in the last 10 years, and that's where a lot of thinking, research, and so on about history is going. And so I suppose the other thing I would say, that always has to be a dialogue between historians, historical fiction writers, other kinds of writers, that in a way it's the dialogue about the meaning of the past that, that we all care about, but we do go about it in a slightly different way.
Would it be the case that in teaching history in schools that historical fiction could play a constructive role there, perhaps?
I do. I do think you could use historical fiction to capture student interest, to help them get the feel of a period, all sorts of reasons to get the more emotional side of history. But I think, as a history teacher in school, I'll be very, very clear that this is historical fiction, and that we should be careful in how we see it in terms of taking it all as literally true. We can see it as something that helps us understand the past. I would also say that whatever period, say, an historical novel is dealing with, I would want students also to read a history. It might be a very imaginatively written history. It doesn't have to be conventional history, but it has to be something that understands itself as history and presents itself in that way.
Okay, and is there anything that we haven't covered so far that you'd like to tell me about in regard to the nature of history?
I would just like to say that the being involved in this project about uncertainty has been really interesting for me, because it's not quite how historians approach it. We don't really talk so much about uncertainty, and yet we're dealing with it all the time. And so in a sense it's foregrounded elements for me about the nature of our knowledge that is not quite how we would usually talk about it. So that I think it's been a productive kind of exchange.
Well, this has been great, Anne. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this, and I think we'll probably wrap things up here.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks very much.